Alright guys, here we go again. So things just escalated to a whole new level. The Middle East is erupting again and it has spread beyond Israel. We are now at a point where things are spiraling out of control. The situation is unraveling within a matter of days. And if you think this oil crisis is over, then you gotta think again because the fuse has been lit. The United States has struck back against Iran and they are sending a clear message to the entire region. Now, just yesterday, American F-16 fighter jets carried out airstrikes on Syrian bases tied to Iranian-linked groups. Now, this is the conflict starting to spread across the Middle East, and it is no longer just confined to Israel. And this comes on the back of President Biden giving a warning to Iran. He warned of a response if American soldiers continue to get attacked. And it doesn't matter if it was Iran doing it directly or through their allied proxies. And guess what? He really did it. This move now opens up Pandora's box, which can evolve into something much bigger. And here's the US statement on these strikes, and this is coming from the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin. Today, at President Biden's direction, US military forces conducted self-defense strikes on two facilities in eastern Syria used by the IRGC and affiliated groups. Lloyd Austin goes on to reassure the Middle East, the United States does not seek conflict and has no intention nor desire to engage in further hostilities, but these Iranian-backed attacks against US forces are unacceptable and must stop. And he ends off by saying this is a separate event. These narrowly tailored strikes in self-defense were intended solely to protect and defend US personnel in Iraq and Syria. They are separate and distinct from the ongoing conflict. The issue here is the black swan events that can emerge from this and the effects that this could really trigger. We have no idea how Iran will take this move. Will they retaliate? Because the next move by the Iranians against the US troops will be met with further escalation. America just demonstrated that, and Lloyd Austin also confirmed it in his statement as well. A few things should be quite clear by now. America will defend their bases in the region, and they are beefing up security in the region as well. According to the Pentagon, around 900 troops will be deployed to the Middle East to bolster their defenses. Let's not forget the two carrier strike groups that are in the Middle East. That's a lot of firepower, and if Iran tries anything, there will be further counterattacks. And let's talk about Iran because that is the biggest wildcard in the Middle East, especially when it comes to oil. Here's the big question. Will the US take action on Iranian oil now? And what if Iranian oil gets taken out of the equation? Just a week ago, Iran called for an oil embargo on Israel. Senators in the US are also drawing up a bill to help seize Iranian oil cargo. So weaponizing oil isn't something that's off limits to both sides, right? In fact, it is likely the next step. Iran's oil exports have been surging above 2 million barrels a day. Now, that is a lot of oil flowing to countries like China. So if the US goes after Iranian oil, we could see up to 2 million barrels suddenly disappear from the market. That's double the amount of the OPEC Plus cuts, which will send oil prices higher. And this isn't a myth. At this point, it is not off the table. The US is likely to tighten sanctions on Iranian crude oil amid the war. Remember, conflicts today are fought not just on the ground, they're just unrestricted to the ground warfare. You can also wage war on the economic front. And going after Iranian oil is one of the last few sanctions the US has left. America might go all the way this time. The West and the Biden administration would at minimum consider curbing Iranian exports, whose levels have been rising higher and higher. The US has said time and time again that Iran must not aid Hamas. In 2020, the State Department reported that Iran spent $100 million a year bankrolling them. And if they cut off the oil supply, then obviously Iran will be too broke to fund them. However, the collateral damage for the whole world will be very severe. We are talking about high inflation and high interest rates for much longer, and that alone could push the economy into a recession. But those are just the sanctions. If Iran's oil fields get taken out, that's it for the global economy for a long time. Remember Lindsey Graham's latest warning, if you escalate the war, we are coming for you. And I think having a conversation about this is important. Israel's about to move in, and if Iranian proxies come from the north, the oil fields might be targeted next. Listen to this. I will introduce a resolution in the US Senate to allow military action by the US in conjunction with Israel to knock Iran out of the oil business. And that could mean pounding their oil fields to oblivion, which will destroy Iran's production capacity for a very long time. but that will take away a ton of oil flowing into the global markets as well. S&P Global forecasts that Iran's oil production will increase moving into 2024. It will go from under 2.8 million barrels a day to over 3.2 million barrels. And this is significant because during the same period, Russia's production won't increase until 2025. It will be stagnant because Moscow wants to keep oil prices high. If the Iranian fields gets taken out, we can kiss goodbye to 3 million barrels a day. That's over 3% of global oil consumption. However, oil demand is inelastic, so prices will go much higher than 3%. That's the big problem. The world will have to scramble to replace the missing production, or everyone will have to pay higher prices to import a lower supply of oil in the market. But it gets wilder. We are moving towards a period of crashing oil production. Oil demand is growing, but production is crashing, especially within the OPEC nations. And with the Middle East on fire, this is only going to get worse. The EIA estimates that global crude oil production growth is going to crash fast. It's heading from 3.4 million barrels a day down to just 0.5 million in 2024. The biggest decrease is coming from the OPEC oil nations, and this forecast is before the Middle East crisis, so we can expect this growth to crash even further, especially if Iran gets taken out. We are on the verge of an oil nightmare. OPEC predicts that the global oil demand will rise by 2.2 million barrels by 2024. Do you see the big problem here? We have production at 0.5 million barrels, but demand is sky high at 2.2 million barrels. If Iranian oil stops flowing, we'll have negative production, which just compounds the oil crisis. However, the supply crunch doesn't just stop there. The world might be losing a huge amount of oil for decades to come. Every oil producing nation has its own reserves of crude in the ground. Iran has the world's third biggest proven oil reserves, coming in at around 209 billion barrels. That is more reserves than Canada and just under Saudi Arabia. So we can see the incentive for America to tighten oil sanctions on Iran. They essentially have a bottomless pit of money for the next few decades at least, thanks to their crude reserves. And here's where things gets tricky. Iran has previously issued a threat to the United States, saying that they won't be spared if the conflict continues. And now they have ramped up the warnings. In a Bloomberg interview, Iran threatened to open new fronts if the US keeps supporting Israel. And this could turn into a regional disaster really fast. The United Nations just passed a resolution calling for humanitarian truce, but it's likely not going to make a big difference. It is not legally binding. The US has objected to it. Israel has also objected, saying they will not stop their operation until Hamas is defeated. There's currently no reverse gear in this conflict. The only question is how far can this escalate? If Iran really joins the fray, America will likely step in and intervene as well. And there's a good chance they will be targeting Iranian oil to financially choke them out. The price of Brent crude is now back above $90 within a matter of hours after the airstrikes, which is insanely volatile. The markets are finally starting to price in the risk. We must understand how dangerous this situation is for the entire world. The Middle East is the oil artery that supplies our modern economy, right? If the oil stops flowing, even if it's just disruption, the entire global supply chain will collapse and inflation will soar. And here's how bad things really are. Even Saudi Arabia is now warning America that a ground war could be catastrophic. They are concerned that this will deal a devastating blow to the stability in the Middle East. There are just so many hotspots that could blow up that go beyond just Iran, right? The choke point of Hormuz could get blockaded. Then 20% of global oil supply could go offline in an instant. Or the fighting could hit other oil producers, then OPEC will scale back their production. Just like how Israel closed their Tamar gas field. Now, if the Gulf states start reducing supply due to fear, a lot of countries will be affected. And the third biggest economy in the world is at the biggest risk. Japan's economy could collapse if the Middle East spirals into chaos. Japan is overly dependent on the region for their energy supplies. Tokyo imports a whopping 95% of its crude from the Middle East. That's almost 3 million barrels a day of oil. And of this amount, Saudi Arabia and the UAE accounts for 2.2 million barrels. This is oil supply locked behind the Strait of Hormuz that is controlled more or less by Iran. So if the choke point gets closed off, the price of oil will spike to the moon and Japan will be left without energy supply. And this means their manufacturing base will collapse. In addition to higher inflation, they're actually in a worse place than Europe, especially when it comes to the Middle East. And this is one example of how dire the oil crisis is. So the cards are now with Iran. They have issued a ton of warnings, but so far they haven't acted on them. And maybe they won't. OPEC didn't support their oil embargo either, so Iran's options are quite limited. But this is a tail risk that could destabilize everything. It's like a 5% risk of the entire global economy collapsing. It is a small chance of the financial apocalypse, and we aren't even factoring other wildcards like China or Russia just yet. We have no idea how things can devolve. And that's why I find it hard to believe that we'll dodge a recession, right? And I mean a global recession. We are now sandwiched in this stagflation hell where nothing makes sense anymore. US GDP numbers are out and we have a shocking 4.9% growth in Q3. That's on par with China. And maybe it has something to do with the huge deficit spending of $1.7 trillion, right? But it doesn't matter to the Federal Reserve. They're only looking at this number, and the only conclusion is that the US economy is being extremely resilient. So they have to crush demand further, and the only tool they have left is to keep rates higher for longer. Then you have oil prices going up, which is going to put a squeeze on consumers as well. Inflation expectations are already hitting higher from 3.2% last month to a whopping 4.2% in October. In other words, people are expecting inflation to rise because prices at the pump are starting to rebound higher. The Middle East fears are starting to get priced in as well. Now, this is horrific for the global economy. We are moving towards a vicious spiral of high interest rates triggered by high oil prices and endless government spending. And the longer this conflict drags on, the more dominoes will fall. The next big financial bombshell will be Biden's $100 billion funding request. We are getting closer and closer towards it. Congress has appointed a new Speaker of the House, and he's moving to split the funding request for Ukraine and Israel. Here's the plan: Israel is a separate matter. We are going to bring forward a standalone Israel funding measure of over $14 billion. The money will be coming from spending cuts and not from borrowing, so approval could happen very soon. Funding for Israel might be expedited and arrive faster than even for Ukraine. But either way it goes, this crisis isn't over, and the Middle East could very well take us to over $100 a barrel. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Will things escalate even further? Will Iran take action, or are they just bluffing us? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.